Hello everyone and welcome to another Blender tutorial. In this one I'm going to show you how to make this plank tower simulation in Blender using the rigid body physics. Now if you haven't watched my rigid body physics for beginners tutorial, I definitely recommend that you watch that. Link will be in the description and there will also be a card right up there on the screen. But I will be going very slowly and showing you the entire process on how to create this rigid body tower physics simulation right here. Now just a couple quick things before we get started with the video. If you'd like to get the project files for this tutorial and also help to support this channel, then a great way to do that is over on my Patreon page. So over on my Patreon page, you can get the project files, you can get artwork project files, procedural materials, and 3D models and assets and things like that. And I also have those same products over on my Gumroad store. So if you'd like to help support the channel with just a one-time purchase, then my Gumroad store is a great place to do that. And if you'd like to help support the channel monthly here on YouTube, then I also have the YouTube memberships. So if you want to learn more about that, you can click on that join button right down there next to the subscribe button. All right, now I'm also going to have my screencast keys right down here so that you can see what buttons I'm pressing during the video. And then also before we start, for the Blender video editors out there, you may have this setting turned on if you do video editing with Blender. Right behind me there's that playback button, and then right here you can see that there's this sync. Now because I do a lot of video editing in Blender, I have this set to sync to audio, and this is just really helpful for video editing in Blender. But when you're doing any type of simulation in Blender, this really isn't good because it kind of like jumps forward in the frames and it can kind of mess up the simulation. So just set this to play every frame. All right, I'm going to select everything and then I'll just press X and delete it. So now I want to make our plank object. So I'm going to press Shift A and I'm just going to add another cube. Now I'm also going to turn on this snapping feature right here. And what this does is it makes it so that when you move around the object, it's going to snap to these increments. And that's going to be really helpful while we're creating our plank simulation. So let's press G to grab, Z on the Z axis, and then we'll just move it up by one increment. And that way it's sitting on the top of our grid. So I'm going to press 7 for top view and I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm now going to press S to scale and I'll press Y so that it goes over on the Y axis. And then I'm going to type in 5 and enter. So now you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grids on this side and then 5 on the other. And then I will tab back into object mode. So this is the plank that I'm going to use and I'll duplicate these to make all the other planks. So before we duplicate all these, let's add the physics to it. So right over here on the physics properties, I'm going to click on rigid body to add the rigid body physics. And then I'm just going to leave everything at the default. You could play around with the different things, like if you want to change the mass, you could do that. Or on the surface response, you could change the friction or bounciness. Some of those settings you can play around with if you want, but I'm just going to leave them at the default. I like how the default settings are. All right, I'm going to press 7 again for top view. And then I want to move this down. So I'll press G to grab and then Y and move it down. And I'm going to move it down by 3 increments. So there is 1, 2, 3 grids in between the plank and the x-axis, that red line there. Then I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate and I'm going to move it up so that there are 3 more. So right there, so that way there's 3 here and then there's 3 more right there. And then also I'm going to press Shift D and I'm going to bring 1 more right back into here to the center. So now I want to rotate these over and put them right here and then duplicate another one and put it right here. So I'll press R to rotate and then I'm going to type in 9, 0 and enter so that it's rotated over by 90 degrees. And then I can press G to grab and move it over and just stick it right here. And then let's also press Shift D and then move this one over and just stick it right here. All right, there we go. So we have our 4 planks. Now we need to move these up so that they're not overlapping, but real quick, let's go File and then click on Save As. All right, and then just save the Blender file somewhere on your computer, and I'm just gonna call it Plank Tower 2, and then I'll click on Save As. All right, and then you can press Control S to save your project while you're working on it. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select this other plank, and then I want to move them up so they're not overlapping. So I'm going to press G to grab, Z on the Z axis, and just move them up by 2 increments, and that way they're just right up here. So this is going to be the base for our plank tower, and so we want to duplicate all these and move them up. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on this, and then hold down the Shift key again and click on this one. So I can now press Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to press Z to move it up on the Z axis, and then you could just move it up right here. I'm going to type in 4 and then hit enter, and that way it's going to move it up by 4 increments. So we could just continue to do that. We could press Shift D and then move it up and just continue to do that, but there's an easier way to do this. If you press Shift R, that's going to repeat the last action that we did. And because we pressed Shift D and then Z and then typed in 4 and enter, we did that all within one action. So now if you press Shift R, it's going to do the same thing and just continue to repeat that. So just press Shift R and just make the tower as big as you want. Now, the more planks you add to your simulation, the laggier and the slower it's going to be, and also it's going to take longer to bake. So if you have a less powerful computer, or maybe you don't want to take a long time for it to bake the simulation, then you could just go with a smaller plank tower, something like this. I'm just going to add a few more, and then I also want to duplicate these towers over to make one big thicker tower. But of course you can make any plank tower that you want. So I'm going to press 7 now to go to top view, and then I'm going to double tap the A key just to make sure I have all the planks selected. I can now press Shift D, and then we still have the snapping turned on, so you can just push it over like that, and then I'm going to select everything again. I'll press Shift D, move these over, and you could just go with that. So now you can see our plank tower is a bit thicker. If I double tap the A key, I can now see right down here that I have 432 objects. So that's 432 planks. I want to add a bit more, so I'm going to press Shift D, move them over, just align them up, and then double tap the A key and press Shift D and just move them over just like that. All right, so now let's double tap the A key, and now you can see that right down here on the objects, I have 1,728 planks, and we have a much thicker tower. All right, so just press Ctrl S again to save your project. So I'm going to press Shift A now, and I'm going to add a plane because of course we need some sort of a ground for the planks to fall on. So I'm going to add a plane, and then I want to scale up really, really big. So I'm going to press S to scale, and I'm going to type in 1,000 and then enter. And then I actually want it to be a little bit bigger than that. So I'm going to press S again and type in 10 and enter. So now you can see that it just goes way off into the distance, and that is what I'm going to use for my animation. All right, and then also just select the plane, and we need to add the rigid body to it, and that way it'll have the rigid body settings. Now, if we played this right now, then the plane would just fall with the other cubes. So what I want to do is change the type here from active to passive. So if you change it to passive, then it's still going to work with the simulation, but it's not going to move. It's going to stay right where it is. So if you press the space bar now to play, you'll start to see that it's kind of moving. It is kind of laggy. There is a lot of planks here, so you can see how laggy it is. Right behind me, it's only playing maybe like a couple frames a second. You can see right here next to me, the little blue line, it's only playing about a couple frames a second. It's pretty slow, and that is of course because there are a ton of planks. All right, so now we can make our sphere, and we can have the sphere smash right in through the tower. Or you could also add like a monkey head or do something else if you wanted to. I'm going to just be using a sphere. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then let's go to mesh, and then I'm going to add a UV sphere. And then we can press S to scale and scale up however big you want. And then also you can press G to grab and just move it over. I'm also going to turn off the snapping because we don't really need the snapping anymore. So I'll just turn that off. I think I'll scale it down a little bit more. And then also I'm going to shade this object smooth. And then I think I also will move it back a little bit farther. All right, and then we also need to add the rigid body to this as well. So just click on rigid body. And then right over here on the settings, I want to turn the mass up and make it a lot heavier, because these planks right here on default, they are 1 kilogram. But if this is 1 kilogram as well, it's just going to kind of bonk into it, and it's not really going to actually push the planks over that much because it's actually not very heavy. So the mass here, I'm going to turn this up a lot to maybe like a 50. So now it's 50 kilograms. It doesn't really matter too much how heavy it is in the real world. It just needs to be heavier than the plank. So these I'm going to set to 1, and then this I'm going to set to 50. All right, so now we need to animate this ball moving over. So we're going to throw the ball into the planks. So how we're going to do this, just press Ctrl S again to save. So let's go to frame 1, and then just make sure the ball is right where you want. So just make sure it's like straight on so that it'll just go right over at the plank tower. Now I'm going to, with the sphere selected, press I, and then I'm going to insert a location. And then also we need to turn on this animated value right here. So what we need to do is we need to tell it it's going to be animated, but then we're going to animate the animated value. And so after we've thrown the cube, we're going to turn that off, and it'll go back to being a simulation. So I'm going to hover my mouse over this check mark, over the animated, and then I'm going to press I, and that's going to insert a keyframe right here on frame 1. Alright, so now just press 3 for side view or 1 for front view, however you have it set up. And I'm going to now move over to frame 10. So now I'm going to press G to grab, and we're going to move this up just like this, just kind of move it over, and then move it up a little bit as well. And then I'm going to press I, and we're going to insert another location. And then we want it to be turned back to a simulation. So I'm going to turn this off, and then I'm going to press I again, and that way it'll turn off. So now if we go back to frame 1 and press the spacebar to play, you can see there it's moving. And then once it gets to frame 10, it's just going to turn back into a simulation and it'll fly over. And let's check it out. There we go. It goes right in. It is kind of laggy. You can see I'm trying to play it and it's not playing in real time. It's kind of laggy, but we can also bake the simulation because this is pretty laggy. All right, so we know that that's working. That all looks pretty good. So if we go back to frame 1 and then play the spacebar again, you can see it has already baked it. And so that is good. But then once it goes over to here, it gets kind of laggy. So I just want to bake the simulation so that we can see it in real time. So I'm going to click right up here on the scene properties. So just click on the scene properties, and then we're going to open up the rigid body world. And then right here under the rigid body world, there is the cache. So if we open up the cache, we can now bake the simulation. So I want to bake this to probably like 1,000 frames. It really depends on how long you want yours to go for. I'm going to bake mine to 1,000 frames, and then just press Ctrl S again to make sure your project is saved. And then you're going to click on bake. Now this might take a little while. It will have a little loading bar to show you how long it's going to take. So you might just want to step away from the computer, come back in a few minutes, and check it out when it's done baking. So I'm just going to click on bake. And you can see that it went really fast because it had already baked this part, but now you can see it's going a little bit slow. So I'll come back to this when it's finished. All right, and it's almost finished. We're at 99%. It only took my computer like a couple of minutes to do the simulation, to bake the simulation, and now it's finished. So right here on the timeline, the end, I'm going to set this to 1000 so that we can play through the entire animation. So let's just press the spacebar and check it out. All right, there we go. Looking pretty good. So in this animation, the ball went a little bit more forward. It had a little bit more momentum. That's totally fine. You can, of course, play around with things if you want. That's looking pretty good. Now, if for some reason you don't like how your simulation is, you can absolutely go back and change some of the settings and then rebake it. So you can just click on Delete Bake, and then you can go back and change some of the different settings. So for instance, you could reanimate the sphere. So if you wanted to have less power or more power, you could also change the speed of the animation. So right here, so if you wanted the entire simulation to be faster, you could turn the speed up or turn the speed down. 1 is the default, so if you turn it up to 2, it's going to be like double the speed. And then of course you could change things like the weight of the sphere. So if you click right back over here, you can see the mass is at 50. You could make it less or more. Really, you can play around with stuff. You can add more towers if you want. You could animate more spheres if you want to do that as well. You can do all sorts of things. So really just play around with it and get it to how you like. I do really like how this animation is, but I would like it to be a bit faster. So right over here, I'm just going to click on Delete Bake, and then I'll change the speed to like 2. And then I'll go back here, and then I'll press Ctrl S again to save, and then I'll just bake this again. All right, and it finished. So let's just play through this, and there we go. So I'm just going to play through this and watch it. And then once the animation is done, I'm just going to set the end frame. So I think I'll just set the end frame to 500. So right here on the end value, I'm just going to change it to 500 and click on enter. And that way it'll just end at 500 frames. So I'll only have to render 500 frames. All right, let's press Ctrl S again to save. Now, before we render out the physics animation, I want to bake these to keyframes. Now you don't have to bake them to keyframes, you could just bake them. It is really important that you at least bake the animation, because I find that if you don't bake it, there can sometimes be issues while you're rendering, and like sometimes it'll stop the physics animation, it'll just keep on rendering it. So just make sure you at least bake it. But for even more security, just to make sure nothing goes wrong with the bake, I'm going to bake them to keyframes. So to bake these to keyframes, I'm going to press A to select everything. Then I'm going to go right here to Object, and I'm going to go right down here to rigid body, and I'm going to click on bake to keyframes. Now before you do this, also just press Ctrl S and make sure your Blender file is saved. So click on bake to keyframes, and then it's going to ask you how many frames you want to bake, and I want the animation to end at 500, so I'm just going to set the end frame to 500 and the start frame to 1, and then the frame step, just keep that at 1, that way it'll bake every single frame. So then just click on OK, and then this will probably take at least a few minutes. And so I pressed OK, and it appears as though Blender has crashed because it's not really responding to anything, and there's no loading bar. I do wish that there was a loading bar. That would be a cool feature, a cool improvement in Blender if they had a loading bar or something, just because right now it appears as though Blender's crashed. You can't really click on anything, but it is baking these out to keyframes, so just wait a little while and then come back and it should be finished. And of course, the bigger the simulation is, the longer it's going to take to bake. Alright, and it finished. So it didn't take my computer too long, maybe like 5 minutes or something like that. I don't know how long, but not very long. Alright, so there's the keyframes. Really important. Let's go File and click on Save. Now, if you wanted to save an increment, you could also save as, and that way it's going to save it as a separate Blender file. And then if you wanted to go back and change the simulation, you could do that. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to click on Save As. And then here is the Plank Tower 2. This is the current version. I'm just going to click on the plus here and change it to Plank Tower 3, and then click on Save As. So now it's a separate Blender file with the baked keyframes. Totally optional, you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I like to do that. Alright, so now if we press the space bar, there we go. It's very smooth because these are all baked to keyframes, and we can just watch it. Now, something to note is that if you click on any of these and then just go right over here to the rigid body, you can see that it's removed the rigid body. So when it baked it to keyframes, it also removed the rigid body. Alright, so this is looking really cool, and we can now do the lighting and the rendering and the materials and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll render this out to a final video. Now, if you'd like to use Blender Eevee, you certainly can. Eevee doesn't look quite as realistic. Cycles is certainly more realistic, but Eevee will also render faster, so really it's just your preference. I'm going to be using the Cycles render engine, but you can totally use Eevee if you'd like to. So I'm just going to go up into rendered mode, and then let's also add the lighting. So for the lighting, you could add like an HDRI lighting. You can of course do whatever you want. I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go down here to light, and I'm going to add the sunlight. I'm now going to press R to rotate, just kind of rotate it over, maybe go out of rendered mode just so that I can see this a little bit better. I need to scale the light up. Here we go. So I'm just going to move this over, probably to something like that. Let's go into rendered mode again, see how that's looking. Alright, just change it to whatever you want. Now, I think I'm also going to go right over here to the light settings, and the strength, I'm going to turn it up to like a 2 so that it's a bit brighter. And then on the color here, I'm going to make it very slightly yellow to kind of look like a sunlight. Alright, so the lighting is very, very boring, and that's because we don't have any HDRI or anything like that. Now, I'm not going to be using an HDRI. You could if you want to. Over here on the world, I'm just going to click on this, and I'm going to change this to the sky texture. So change it to the sky texture. And then if we go into rendered mode, you can see this is what it looks like. Now there's a few different settings you can play around with. Right here on this setting right here, I totally don't know how to pronounce that, but I'm going to change it to this one. Again, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong if I try to pronounce it, but it starts with the H. So I'm going to change it to this one because I think this one looks pretty cool. So this is just a very nice blue sky kind of texture. And then you can click back over here on the light. You could turn this up if you wanted to. I think maybe I'll turn it up to a 3 so it's a bit brighter. All right, I'm just going to go into the material preview so that it isn't quite as laggy. So let's set up the materials. So I'm going to click right over here on the sphere, and then let's go over to the shading tab, and that way we can use Blender's shader nodes to set up the materials. So I'm just going to click on new here on the sphere. I want to make it like a shiny metal sphere, so I'm going to turn the metallic value all the way up to 1, and then I'll turn the roughness way down to like a 0.2 so it's very shiny. So if I go into rendered mode, you can see that's what it looks like, and I like that. All right, and then let's go over here and just click on one of the planks. I'm going to press period to jump over to the plank, and then let's click on new. So I can just call this material planks. And then for the base color here, you could just change it to like a kind of a wood color or whatever you want to do. I'm just going to make it kind of like a basic wood color. All right, so what we want to do now is we want to make the plank material on all of the other planks. So to do that, I'm just going to press A to select everything, and then I will press B for the box select and hold down my middle mouse wheel and drag and just deselect the ground and the sphere and the light. And then also hold down the shift key and just make sure this is the last object object selected. And again, to know that it's the last object selected, it's going to be a yellow outline, and then these are going to be an orange outline. So now we can press Control L and we can link the materials. So that way, all the other objects that are selected are going to have the same material. So now if we go into render mode, it does look pretty cool, but you can see the planks almost look like they're just one object. And also it is a little bit boring that they're all the exact same color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to add the object info node. Now you can see this object info node has a random value. So if you plug the random up to the base color, you can see that it's randomly going to generate different colors between the different objects. So every object is going to be a slightly different color. Now to tell it what colors we want, we can press Shift A and I can just search for a color ramp. We'll just drop the color ramp right in here. And then right here in the color ramp, we can change it to the different colors that we want. So on this black tab right here, I'm just going to make it like a bright, sort of like a wood color. You could make like a procedural wood material or really do whatever you want. I just like this basic color like that. All right, and then let's click on this one. And then this one is going to be a very similar color, but it's going to be a little bit darker and maybe just a little bit more saturated. Now I have the Node Wrangler add-on turned on, so I can hold down the Control and Shift key and click on the color ramp to preview what that looks like. You could also just plug the color into the surface. If I just take this color here and plug it into the surface of the material output, you can see that is the albedo or the color of all of our planks. So you can then play around with this if you want to be more contrasty or if you want to add more colors. Something like that is pretty good. So I'm going to Control, Shift, and click back on the principled BSDF. If you don't have the Node Wrangler turned on, you can just plug the BSDF back up to the material output. So there we go. Now if you zoom in, you can see that every plank is just a slightly different color and it makes it look a lot more unique. All right, and then I'm going to select the ground and let's just click on New to make a new ground material. Now this one, I think I want to make it slightly blue. I think that looks pretty cool. And then I'll also turn the roughness down to like a 0.15 so that it's pretty shiny. So we can go back over to the layout now, and then I can just play through this. So you can see if I just go into rendered mode and kind of zoom in here, you can see that because we turn that roughness value down, you can kind of see the reflection there in the ground. And I think that looks pretty cool. So you could leave it like that if you want to, but I actually want to make the ground look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to be using a surface imperfections texture. So here's the surface imperfections texture that I'm going to be using. And this is on ambient CG. So it's surface imperfections 003. And I'm just going to be downloading the 4K JPEG. So link will be in the description if you'd like to download this. It's totally optional, but it will add some more detail to the ground. All right, so I'm going to click back over here on the ground and then I'll go back to the shading tab. So to add it into the roughness, I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to search for an image texture and then let's just click on open to open up the surface imperfection. So when you download the texture, you're going to get a zip file. So when you extract the zip file, then you're going to have these different maps in here. I'm just going to click on the black one and then click on open image. Now, because we want to plug this into the roughness, we also need to set the color space to non-color, and then let's plug the color into the roughness value. So now if I go into rendered mode, we can start to see what it looks like. Now the scale is way too big, so we can't really see it taking effect. So what we need to do is we need to play around with the UV editing. So I'm going to go right over here to the UV editing tab. So here is the plane, but because the plane is so big, we're not really able to see the surface imperfection. If I go into the material preview, you can't really see it. So let's press S to scale, and we're just going to scale it up really, really big. And now you can see right here in the reflections, you can start to see the surface imperfection texture. So just scale it up to the size that you want. You can also go into rendered mode and just see how that's looking. So you can see here's the effect that we're getting. It is subtle, but it just gives a little bit more detail there. And especially right here in the reflection of the sunlight, you can really see it taking effect. All right, and that is looking very good. So now we can add a camera and then animate the camera. So I'm going to press Shift A and then let's go right down here to camera. So let's just move to the very starting and then just move the camera to wherever you want. So I think I'm just going to have the camera right about here. And then to bring the camera to where we are, we can press Control Alt Numpad 0 and now the camera is right where we are. And then I can also press G and double tap Z and then we can move our mouse and that'll move the camera in and out. Now you can animate the camera, of course, however you want, or you don't have to animate the camera if you want to just be still. And also if you want the camera to change different angles while the animation is going, then you can check out my tutorial on how to use camera binding. I'll leave the link right up there on the card, and also the link in the video description on how to use camera binding in Blender. And that way you can like have a frame right here and play that for a little while, and then you can switch it to another frame, and then you can play that for a little while. So you'll be able to switch cameras within the animation. I'm just going to animate one camera kind of moving along, but you could use camera binding if you'd like to. Alright, so to animate this camera, I'm going to turn on the auto keying, and that way when we move the camera and then click to place it, you can see that it's automatically going to add a keyframe. So now let's just play through this. So you can see it's kind of smashing. So let's go over to maybe frame 100, and then we can move the camera. So I'm going to just move to the location that I want, maybe something like that. And then I'll press Control Alt Numpad 0, and that's going to hop the camera to where we are. And we can just move it around by pressing G to grab. And then let's just play through this, and you can see there the camera is moving. All right, so now let's go maybe to frame 250, and I'm going to move to a different spot, maybe like down here. And then I'll press Control Alt Numpad 0 to hop the camera to where we are. And you can see that it's automatically adding a keyframe, so that is super helpful. We don't have to add our own keyframes. It's going to automatically add a keyframe. All right, so now let's go past frame 500 a little bit, maybe to 520, just so that the camera will have some time before it slows down and stops. And then let's just go to another location. So I think I'll just move up a little bit, and then I'll press Control Alt Numpad 0. And we can just move out a little bit, something like that. All right, so now let's play through this and see what it looks like. All right, so that is good. There we go. And then you can kind of see that last tower just falling down, and then it slows down. All right, now at the starting here, you can see that the camera starts to speed up because the keyframe starts at frame 0. So I'm going to click on the keyframe to select it, and then I'm going to move it over just a little bit back, farther back. And that way, when we play it now at frame 1, the camera's already going to be moving. All right, so once you're happy with your animation, you can turn off the auto key. Make sure you turn it off, because if you don't turn it off, then anytime you move something, it's going to mess it up. And now we can do our render settings. So just go into rendered mode. You can just watch through the animation. Now real quick, I do think I want to rotate the sun, because you can see that right here, the sun is kind of behind it. So I want to just kind of rotate the sun. So I'm just going to double tap R and just rotate the sunlight a little bit. And that way the lighting is just pointed a little bit better to where our camera is, so it's not in a bunch of shadow right here. And then also before we do the render settings, I do want to add a depth of field, because that can just help to make it look a lot better. So I'm going to click on the camera, and then on the camera settings, you can turn on the depth of field. Now we need to choose something for the camera to focus on, so I want the camera to focus on the sphere. So right here, the focus object, if you click on the eyedropper, you can click on the sphere object, and then if we just go into rendered mode, we can see that it's only going to focus on the sphere. Now you can't see it really taking effect right now, so the f-stop, if we turn this way down, maybe to like a 0.01, you can start to see it taking effect. So you can see that now things in the front and things in the back are a little bit blurred. Now that is a little bit too strong. I don't think I want the depth of field to be quite that strong, so maybe I'll change it to like a 0.05. Yeah, that is a lot better. And you can also see that the background is just blurred a little bit, and I like that as well. All right, so now let's do the render settings, and then we can render this out. So right over here on the output properties, we can set up the samples. Now I'm actually going to change the samples really, really small to only like a 10, because I find that we don't really need that many samples. We can just set it to a 10. And then what we'll do is we'll use Blender's Denoise node to denoise the image. Now, if you want the image to look nicer, you could turn it up, but I find that the Denoise node does such a great job that for a scene like this, the lighting is so simple, and there's not really many complex materials or shaders. All right, so that is good. There is a few more things we can do though to make the render faster. So right here over on the light paths, we can turn down the light paths, and that'll make Blender render faster. So on the clamping here, we can turn these all to 0. So indirect lighting, I can turn to 0. The filter gloss here, I can turn to 0, and I can also turn off the caustics, and that way Blender will render faster. And then also on the light paths, I'm going to turn the transmission to 0, volume to 0, and transparency to 0. I'll just turn those all down. down. Now, if you turn the glossy down, you can see that there's going to be some shading issues with the sphere because it's so reflective. So you could just turn it up to maybe like 1 or 2 just so that it looks a little bit more realistic. And then also if you turn the diffuse down, you can see that something looks a little bit weird there. The lighting is a little bit weird because we turned the light bounces down so far. It's really dark in there. So I'm just going to turn the diffuse up to like a 4, and then the total also leave that at 4. That way you can just see a little bit more inside those planks. All right, that is really great. So let's now go over to the output properties. Now for an animation like this, it really is best to render out all the frames to images, and then we can just put them together as an image sequence in Blender's video editor. So right here on the output, I'm going to click on this folder to set the output. And then right here in my files, I'm going to click on the plus right here to add a new folder, and I can just call this frames. And then let's just go inside the folder, and then we can just click on accept. And that way it's going to render out all the frames to that folder. And then also the file format, I'm going to set this to PNG, and that way it'll render out all the frames to PNG images. You could also set them to JPEG if you want the frames to be less storage space. And then one more thing you can do to make the animation look really cool, if you turn on the motion blur, that's going to add motion blur. So while the planks are falling, they're going to be blurred a little bit. I really like this, so I'm going to turn this on because I think it just makes it look a lot better. So let's just press Ctrl S to save again, and then you can just press F12 to render out 1 frame. All right, so because we only rendered it out with 10 samples, it is a little bit grainy, but we're going to use Blender's Denoise node to denoise the image and make it look really nice. So let's click right over here on the compositing tab, and then I'm just going to click on use nodes to use the compositing nodes, and then let's just press Shift A, and I'm going to add the Denoise node. I'm just going to drop the Denoise node right here in between the render layers and composite. And then I also have the Node Wrangler add-on turned on, so I can press Control and Shift and then click on the node. You can also just press Shift A and then search for a viewer node, and then we want to plug the viewer node right up here. And because the viewer node is plugged up, we can now preview the final render in the backdrop. And you can see how well of a job that Denoise node does. It really smooths out the image and makes it look really nice. All right, so just press Ctrl S to save again, and then we can press Ctrl F12 or just click on render and then click on render animation, and it'll render out all the frames to the folder. All right, so the render finished, and so I am now in a new scene in Blender, and we're just going to video edit the frames together. So I'm going to click on the video editing tab. Now, if you don't have this tab, you can click on the plus right here and then go to video editing and add the video editing tab. And then right down here, I'm going to press Shift A, and we're going to add image sequence. And then here is all of the rendered frames. So just press A to select all the frames and then click on add image strip. And then you're going to need to set the frame rate and the resolution to the same frame rate and resolution of your video. I just have this at 2K resolution, and then I did render this out at 24 frames per second. So in the other Blender file, just make sure it's the same as this file. And then we can set the end frame. So I'm going to set the end frame to 500 frames, and then we can just watch the final animation. And I really like the motion blur as well. It adds a lot to the animation. So right down here on the output, you can set the output. So I'm going to save this on my desktop as video. And then on the file format, I like to use FFmpeg video. And then right under here on the encoding, I like to use a container of MPEG-4. And then the video codec, I set that to H.264 and medium quality and good. And then if you have any audio, you could set it to AAC or also just no audio if you don't have any audio. And then you can just click on render and then click on render animation. All right, and here is the finished animation up on the screen. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And again, if you'd like to help support the channel, I will have links to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships as well. But again, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in a future video.